I see we also have a David P. on the Zoom. I was just wondering, if David, if you could introduce yourself.
Yep, David Pickett with the Malaysia Climate Smart Committee.
Okay, great. Nice to have you. And Wendy, you're supervisor in Stanford.
Yes, I am.
Folks who don't know Wendy, so glad to have you. So yeah, we can get started. Today is a very special session. We have Brandy Nelson here from Ty and Bond. Brandy is volunteering to partner with us on the Local Champions program. And Brandy's going to tell you a little bit more about her background and what she does, but consider today really an introduction to the world of actually getting things done. So where the rubber hits the road, right? Like you are all formulating your plans on what climate actions you want to prioritize and your roadmap for when you're going to get those done. You probably are, questions beget questions, right? And a lot of these projects may entail almost phases as you think them through towards actual implementation. And so Brandy's going to get into what those phases might be. And especially if we're talking about projects where you're actually building something, buying something, installing something, where it's not just a policy or an event, but you're actually you're going to need a capital investment, for instance, to be able to put something into action. This is the sort of work that Brandy is going to coach you through. So again, this is an introduction. Flowing from this session, you will each have access to Brandy for consultations. So it's 3 hours for each of you. You can do that in an 1.5 hour chunk, or you could do it in 3 1-hour chunks. It'll be up to you individually to schedule those with Brandy. She has created a Calendly tool. Well, it's basically a scheduling tool where you can book those appointments with her. So we'll share that. For the consultations, we do recommend that you bring in your liaison to your town or village board that you work with. Or perhaps there's another person interested on the board in a particular project. So it's great to kind of share this opportunity to work with Brandy with someone on the board, and so that you're not basically, so you're giving them access to ask questions as well as yourself. So with that, excuse me, I'd like to turn it over to Brandy.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Good morning. It's nice to see you all. I'm going to just try and share screen here from my desktop. Let's see. Move you guys over where I can see you all. All right. Can everyone see what I'm sharing on the screen? Is that good for everyone? Okay, great.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can advance the slides. Still seeing? Are you guys still with me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we'll do a high-level technical assistance for municipalities. We want to cover kind of the high-level technical assistance, so how various technical resources can be brought to bear to support the work you're doing with the Climate Smart Communities program. And then how feasibility studies can be a part of that, and how that can support your grant pursuits under Climate Smart Communities, which often for municipalities are really essential in helping you achieve the goals and really towards implementing your plan, which is your ultimate goal here. It's not just to go through this planning exercise, but to implement. So our objectives for our session today is to get an overview of technical assistance and how that can help you with your Climate Smart Communities program. To understand the basics of what someone means when they say, oh, you're going to need a feasibility study for that. To understand a little bit more about how feasibility studies can support your grant funding process. And I understand you may have had a session with Kristen Wilson on grant funding. So this should be complementary to what Kristen shared with you. And then to learn how technical assistance and feasibility studies can help improve your outcomes and ultimately move you towards your implementation goals. So I'll give you a quick introduction about our firm. So Ty and Bond was founded in 1911. We have about 500 people. We're located in 13 offices across the Northeast, and I'm joining you from our Rhinebeck, New York office. We're an interdisciplinary firm offering planning, permitting, resiliency, engineering, and environmental science, landscape architecture, and GIS and asset management services. So we're a full service engineering firm in the Northeast. I don't know that I've met anyone here previously except for Tom Pino. So nice to see you, Tom. Look forward to meeting the rest of the group here. But I'm a professional engineer and I'm a lead AP. So lead is leadership in energy and environmental. I'm an accredited professional and have had that certification since 2000. So I was sort of one of the early people. I've always had an interest in the nexus between the environment and engineering and how the two can make for better communities. Um, I want to just give you a tiny little background about myself. I'm live in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, but I've worked in the Hudson Valley in Eastern New York for more than 25 years. I have 2 kids. I'm really passionate about local communities. I'm involved in my own community as the chair of my planning board. And I have tried to bring my passion for local communities to my work in civil and environmental engineering. And I work both with public and private clients, primarily in the planning and land development sector. So happy to talk with any of you about specifics of particular projects as we get into our individual sessions. And hopefully I can bring some of the experiences I've had in other communities to help you be more successful with your climate smart pursuit. So, in terms of why you're pursuing climate smart communities, it's probably to help improve your community, which falls under our broad category of community development. And so I like to frame that up as a process, as I say here on the screen, of building a social fabric that can provide for equitable opportunities in housing, infrastructure, the environment, and economic development, and really with a focus on how changes in the climate affect all of those areas. And we want to focus on sustainability, that triple bottom line principle of economic, environment, and equity. So, people, places, and opportunities. We also want the projects that we're pursuing in our communities to build resiliency. And I think that's a word that probably needs a lot of education in our communities, but it's really at its core, it's building capacity to manage for change. And we're seeing a lot of change in a lot of different areas, at least even just in the last 20 years in my own career. And then in terms of your role as volunteers in your communities, understanding that the municipal government has concerns around risk management and wants to understand vulnerabilities and be prepared to manage risk, oftentimes because of the impact that it has to the residents in a community, and also the impacts that it has economically in the community. So very broadly, technical assistance is non-financial assistance. So it's not necessarily a grant. It may be funded by a grant, but it's non-financial assistance where you're gaining specialty expertise. You're sharing information, maybe receiving instruction or providing instruction. You're receiving skills training, and there's knowledge sharing. And consulting services that might involve the transfer of technical data. We'll get into some of the specifics of what that means as we go through this session. So technical assistance can come from a really wide number of places, and As small communities, I recognize that communities are often strapped for resources. And so where you can find supportive services to achieve your goals out with other organizations, other governmental agencies, part of what we want to do is help you identify those resources so that you can really leverage any dollars that your community might be spending to achieve your climate smart goals. So some places where you can get technical assistance from maybe at the state or county funded level. Um, the county planning departments are often great resources. I know in particular Dutchess County is an excellent resource. They have planners that are assigned to each of the towns, and they have been very collaborative partners with a lot of communities in making different demographic data sets available, and really just being a place where you can make an inquiry about information pertaining to your community or the larger surrounding region. Similarly, Columbia counties got a smaller planning department, but they also have some resources available. If you've not met Patrice Perry, she's been a longtime fixture at the county and is very keen to support local efforts to leverage the data that she has out of her office. Greene County, I have not engaged as much. I don't know if we have anyone from Greene on the call. Do we,
Yeah,
Vanessa?
Margaret.
Yes, I am from Green, and
Okay,
Green is pretty conservative, and our county legislature is kind of back in the dark ages.
okay. So historically, they've had good mapping data available to help support projects, but as far as planning, Margaret, you may want to use resources that are available regionally through some of the nonprofit organizations or through the state as well. So, we'll try and work with you to connect you to some resources at a higher level. Ulster County, I think, is similar to Dutchess and has a nice planning department that is very supportive of efforts to provide technical assistance. There's also the regional planning agencies that cover different areas, including planning, resiliency, transportation, and so we can help get you plugged into those. If you've not worked with your soil and water or cooperative extension offices, they are excellent resources as well. I've specifically worked in Greene County with the cooperative extension, and for certain issues around flooding, they are a great resource to work with. There's organizations like Scenic Hudson, the local land conservancies. All of these can be very supportive in your efforts to receive technical assistance as you start working on specific projects related to your climate smart. There's also private consultants like myself. Typically, we're hired for a particular area of expertise. We tend to work in a wide range of arenas with states and counties and localities, and so we can bring a wide range of experience to bear for your community. Sometimes we're hired directly by communities. Your community may already have a municipally designated engineering consultant that's available for on-call services, kind of as needed services. So you should check that in your community if you're not aware of that already. Sometimes consultants are hired individually for project-specific purposes. Maybe they're grant funded, and there are also opportunities for consultants to provide pro bono services for different communities. So really just, it's a conversation you want to have. When we have our first session together, what I'd like to do is learn a little bit more about some of your specific goals and maybe where you're already plugged into some technical assistance. And then I'll work to try and fill in some gaps for you with some other possible sources of technical assistance. I want to just make a note about procurement. I'm not an attorney, I'm an engineer, so I'll start with that caveat. But if you are or your community is procuring goods or services, they need to conform with the requirements of both state and local laws around procurement. And so I say this just because I'm not sure of your specific level of awareness or engagement there. Most communities have a procurement officer um, who facilitates purchasing within the community, and they'll understand the specifics of your community's requirements for procuring goods and services. New York, as in many states, wants there to be a public process for procurement to try and make sure that taxpayer dollars are being spent in an equitable and transparent way. So there are specific steps that need to be undertaken for procuring any kind of goods or services. So just be aware of that, please. And also, in terms of grants that you may be pursuing, some of the grants have very specific procurement policies that you should be aware of. Um, and it's really program by program. And so you really need to just work carefully to check to see what the procurement requirements are. Usually any services you utilize before you receive a grant are not eligible for reimbursement under that grant. And oftentimes, once you receive a grant, one of the first steps that you have to undertake is a procurement process for maybe professional services or contract services for labor. And there are a number of different means of procuring services. Sole source, which means, you call a person and they are hired to do the work for you. There's a lowest responsible price, and then there's a qualifications-based selection process where price isn't necessarily a factor. You're looking for the most qualified entity to provide particular services to you. So again, I'll just caution you all to just be aware of the procurement practices and understand that in terms of schedules for implementation of projects or moving forward with grants, procurement does take a little bit of time. It's usually going to take somewhere between 3 and 6 weeks for you to undertake a procurement process. And so just factor that in terms of how your project is progressing. So as far as the technical assistance process, there's kind of 3 big buckets that we want to proceed with as we start working with you. The first will be information gathering. So we'll want to learn more about your particular needs for technical assistance in terms of maybe some of the specific climate smart objectives that you're pursuing. The second bucket is information sharing. So that's where we want to understand what you have already done, and this cohort of climate smart community technical support that we're doing is different than the first cohort we did. It sounds like Paige and Vanessa have been working with you for several months now to move you through a very informative process with a lot of additional steps. The last time I undertook this technical support services, it was earlier in the process, and so there was more that the group wasn't aware of or didn't have their arms around yet. So I'm looking forward to learning where you all are on your journey and how we can help support you. So that'll be our information sharing, and then information analysis. So once we know what your objective is and what you know already, we can analyze and try and identify where you are missing data or missing information or need to be plugged into resources so that we can move you along in your process towards achieving your goals. So under the information gathering phase, this is really the kind of information I'll be looking for from you all as we plan to meet. And the question for you is, what has my community done to set goals? So, where are you in your process? What kind of public meetings have you engaged in? What kind of community visioning sessions, if any, have you had? Are there community-based planning exercises that your community has already undertaken that we can leverage in your climate smart goals? I understand that each of your communities has already gotten buy-in from your municipal board, so I think that's really key. And I'm glad to hear Vanessa say that you've got liaisons to the municipal boards, because having that partner at that level is really important for being able to actually implement these climate smart goals. So community-based planning efforts that you've already undertaken that might be available to your community might be your comprehensive plan. If you've got one that is updated in, I would say, even the last 15 years, it's probably got a lot of really good information in it that you can leverage moving forward with your climate smart plan. Your waterfront revitalization plan if you're a waterfront community. And if you've already undertaken some of the climate smart communities planning, it'd be helpful to understand where you are in that process. And then the other thing we're going to do is take a look at, again, where in your community you've got data sets that can support your implementation goals. And so some other documents that may exist in your town or village hall that could be leveraged might include a capital improvement plan. Usually that's something that's used for capital budgeting, often with your highway departments or your DPWs. Asset management plan, if your community has municipal infrastructure such as sewer or water, you may have some asset management planning tools that identify what specific infrastructure you have and what its life is and whether or not it's ready for upgrades. And then when you go to make those upgrades, you'd want to make them as climate smart as possible with the latest energy efficiency technology and monitoring technology. Hazard mitigation plan. Most of the counties should have current hazard mitigation plans or hazard mitigation plans that are undergoing an update. And each of the countywide, they're called countywide multi-jurisdictional hazard mitigation plans. Each of those has an annex in the back for each community within that county. And so that is a resource also, and it's a very relevant plan for climate smart. A lot of what is done in the hazard mitigation plan is a look back over what hazards have impacted a community over the last 5 years. And so you get a window into what has my community been dealing with in terms of snowstorms, ice storms, flooding, hurricanes. I don't think we've had any tornadoes in the last 5 years, but all of those things get captured in the hazard mitigation plan. And then the plan has not only a look back as to what has impacted your community, but it also has a look forward as to what projects the community has identified as needing to be undertaken to improve resiliency in the community. And so there may be some specific things that can help support some of your climate smart projects in that hazard mitigation plan. So we'll try and plug you into those. There's sea level rise data. The state of New York has, for our waterfront communities, some pretty good sea level rise data that is useful for assessing potential impacts to infrastructure along the river. There's demographic data. This can be obtained from the state and also from the federal government with the most recent census that was undertaken. There's a community census survey data set that is wide ranging for demographic data about your community. So it's got things like the age range in your community, income levels in your community, which can be important for understanding environmental justice areas. It's also got information on age of housing stock, which can give you some insights into energy efficiency within that community. It can give you information on the educational level in your community. So there's just a huge array of demographic data that is available that can help support your individual climate climate smart pursuits. And then there's geographic information system data. And this would be data that you guys maybe have seen in things like your natural resource inventories for your communities. It's generally spatial data related to different environmental and physical characteristics in your community. So it could be things as simple as aerial imagery of your community, looking back over a historic time period so that you can see how land use patterns have changed. It can include topographic information, and it can also include specific information about natural resources in your community and where they are in relationship to developed areas in your community. So lots of information out there. As we get into discussing your particular needs, we will try and identify where you've already connected with those data sets. And if it looks like there are areas where you can leverage other data sets, we'll try and plug you into those.
Wendy's
Brandy,
got her hand up too. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
Oh, hi, Wendy.
hi, Brandy. I'm very proud to say we're about to pass our first revised comprehensive plan in 40 years.
Wow.
And it may cost
Congratulations.
me a reelection, in November, but that's okay.
Amazing.
We're getting it done.
Yeah.
My question is this: we just secured a grant for a natural history, a natural resource inventory.
Mhm.
We're working with both Hudsonia and with the Cornell Cooperative,
Mhm.
but we lost our precious leader
Mm.
just recently and very suddenly, who had drafted the grant so that he was going to write the narratives, all the
Mm.
narratives.
Mhm.
So do you have any suggestions? And I realize this is a pretty specific question, but can we get aid for that? We've been poking around trying to find scientists in the community or even at Cornell Cooperative that could volunteer to do that work, because we built it into the budget that would be volunteer work.
Mhm. Mhm.
Is that something you can help us with? Like guide us towards how we can get the proper person to do that.
Yeah, I made a note here, and I can look into that. I think, so many of our communities, and my own community included, rely on the energy of volunteers. And when you lose those key volunteers, that can be a real challenge because they leave big holes. The first thing would be, are there any other volunteers out there that maybe have some similar background? Is there a network that you can work to try and identify someone? Outside of that, we've had a little bit of luck with some of the educational institutions in the area, finding maybe a graduate student or somebody who's interested in taking on an internship role. A lot of times you can get them, if not for free, for a fairly modest fee, because they're doing it for an educational involvement, or and maybe towards a degree program. So we can maybe talk about if we can find someone there. And then lastly, going back to the funding agency and asking if they can give you a budget increase due to a change in circumstances. It's worth an ask. Sometimes it's not possible, but worth an ask.
Right. I had a boss who used to say, if it was awfully annoying, but he'd say, if you don't ASK, you don't GET. So,
Yeah, probably fair.
okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that for you. That's tough.
It was awful, but
True. Um, Yeah, I mean, I've worked with a number of communities in the area who have just been blessed with retired IBMers, and they are just amazing resource in their communities when they retire. So
yeah.
we need more of those, got to call IBM, I guess. Um, so moving on from gathering information, we want to share information and understand what your team currently consists of. So, are you Melissa, are you on your own, or do you have a network of people that are helping support you? Who is your go-to official in the community who's expressed some support, who can kind of be your champion at the municipal level? As Wendy and I were just saying, those volunteers are key. Who's that network of volunteers that you can tap into? And then is there an opportunity to expand that? I think multi-generational volunteering is really underutilized. there are really bright young people that would benefit tremendously from being partnered with some of our more experienced volunteers and communities, and they just have such a fabulous opportunity for civic engagement that just doesn't happen anymore. Vanessa's got some good stories around civically engaged young people and just how they can bring a fresh perspective to your team. So encourage you to think broadly there in terms of who your volunteers might be. And then who are the technical resources that you can tap into? And that's that list that we referred to earlier in the presentation. We want to have some robust communication with you. So really, I like having a kind of a wide-ranging conversation with you about what your goals and objectives are and how we can help you specifically with some of the more technical aspects. I think there are a tremendous number of resources out there that maybe are not engineers and planners, and we will try and plug you into those and try and bring our skill set to bear for you, specifically if you've got more technical questions pertaining to planning or engineering or design or infrastructure, or rainfall patterns or heat waves, things like that that we're really tapped into. And then, I'll be clear about what we can do and what we can't do. We have a limited amount of time with you. We've got 3 hours. I'll provide you our Calendarly link. It's a new tool that I'm using, so um, we'll learn how to use Calendarly together, but my understanding is that you'll be able to find blocks of time that work for both of us. And we may want to do, one 30 or 60-minute block and then maybe one 2-hour block that's a little bit more beefy. That first block being more getting to understand and know you. And then I'll do some homework and maybe you'll do some homework, and then we'll come back and we'll work on achieving the objective that we had set in that first meeting in our second meeting. And then we are a big fan of SMART goals. And so I hear from Vanessa, a couple of you are already pending bronze certification. So congratulations, that's really huge for your communities. But are there goals beyond that bronze certification that you're looking to implement? And are those goals aligned with other plans that you have in your community? Because that can sometimes make selling them to your municipal leadership a little bit more attainable. All right, so our first meeting will be focused on gathering information. Our second meeting will be focused more on analyzing that information. And to do that, we want to make sure that we've sort of clearly defined what we're working on with you, that we've got the data to support that. And we will try and help you identify whether or not we can come to a resolution just in a technical session, or if there are other intermediate actions that need to be undertaken. And then we'll also try and point you in a direction for implementation. Do you need to do some additional analysis? Is there a study that needs to be undertaken? Can you just move forward and apply for a grant? It'll really this is a little bit abstract as far as analyzing information because I'm not sure what your particular goals are, but these are sort of the framework questions that we'll use to move forward with implementation. So just real briefly, Kristen may have touched upon this when she talked with you guys about grants, but just in terms of what is a grant, they are funds to support a portion of your project costs. A lot of times your project costs are derived from talking with vendors or consultants about what the costs of a particular project are going to be, and then understanding, what can the community contribute in terms of funds or in-kind services, and then what needs to be covered by the grant. Grants can come from a number of different sources. So my next slide is about a lot of the sources that the state of New York has made available. But there are also private foundations and there are public-private partnerships that provide different grant funding opportunities. And so you just want to be clear about, what is your community eligible for? Are there ways for your community to partner with a private entity and leverage a different pool of funds? So understanding eligibility is key. Most grants are competitive. If anybody can find just a money tree, that would be great. But most of the grants are competitive, and so you need to think strategically about whether or not you meet not only the eligibility requirements, but also the program objectives. And we do a fair amount of grant applications for both private and municipal clients through the New York State Consolidated Funding process. And if you're unsuccessful with a grant, I really want to encourage you to undertake that debrief process with the state, where they'll give you some feedback on why you were not successful in that grant. Sometimes it's simply a matter of the need is much greater than the available funds, and they just have to draw a funding line at a certain point, and then everybody below the funding line, they're really sorry, apply again next year. Sometimes it's just a matter of, is your community really hitting on all the eligibility requirements and then all the programmatic requirements? So, sometimes there's a focus on environmental justice communities. Sometimes there's a focus on natural resource protection. So you really just need to dig into the details of each grant funding opportunity to see what the eligibility requirements are and how you can be most competitive in applying for that. And I would say, don't be afraid to say, no, this isn't the right grant funding opportunity for me, because you can spend a lot of precious time and resources making applications that maybe wouldn't be successful, and your time would be better spent on a more focused effort. Application process is always very prescriptive, and so you want to make sure you're following it to a T. And be really aware of who the applicants are. Sometimes you get points for partnering either with a private entity or another municipality. Typically, the state of New York has been very favorable where there is joint application between multiple communities. So I have to look at the list of this cohort to see if any of you are abutting one another. I think I saw Kinderhook. Is Kinderhook and Chatham? Are they abutting one another? Yeah, so those are opportunities where you can collaborate with other municipalities. You want to think about deadlines, and one thing I'll say about deadlines, and as it relates to schedules and the funding cycle, is that typically the grant funding process is a long lead time. So if you want grant funds this year, there are no public dollars available for you. Typically, grant funding cycles run such that um, you're making your application, and then it's maybe 4 to 6 months before the state reviews and notifies you of your award, and then it's another 1 to 3 months while you contract with the state agency, and then you get into your grant cycle. So, if you're looking for funds for next year, you want to start looking for grant opportunities this year. Give yourself a year to 18 months, though, on grant funded projects. And then if they're, design and construction projects, it's another year to 18 months. So it's a slow process. And if you're working with a consultant or a volunteer group, make sure you're asking those questions about how the grant works into your proposed project schedule and whether or not it can align with your proposed project schedule. This is super tiny, and I apologize. I'm not going to quiz question you on what the content of this slide is, but what I will say about this slide is that the state of New York in particular has their consolidated funding application process, and we typically see the CFA guide come out in early May, and so you want to start looking for it. It typically is driven by the state budget, and so it's always a wonder how the state budget gets passed, but about a month afterward, you'll see the grant funding opportunity, and then If the cycle for this year is the same as previous years, applications under the CFA are typically due at the end of July. And it does take about 8 weeks for you to put your applications together. A lot of the applications need municipal resolutions. You have to keep that in mind in terms of the timing of your application. And typically what I would encourage you to do is to start thinking now about what projects you want potentially to seek grant funds for. One of the things I can talk about with you is what programs are out there. There are programs through many different state agencies. There are programs through EFC, that's the Environmental Facilities Corporation. There's programs through Empire State Development. Those are typically tied to improving economic opportunities in your community, job creation, economic development. There are funds available through the Hudson River Estuary Program for bridge, culvert, drainage assessments, watershed protection assessments. There are program funds available through Office of Parks. So it's more than I can get into right now, but I'd say there's somewhere between 30 and 40 different programs, and they each have specific requirements, but they're all due at the end of July typically. So we can help you try and align your projects with potential funding sources. And then I typically produce this summary table, and I would send you specifically the programs where I think your projects might be eligible, and then the criteria, like whether or not you need a municipal resolution, whether or not you need a feasibility study, which we'll get into in the next slide, whether or not you need estimates from vendors, because all those things take time. Letters of support, if you're going to do an application jointly with another community, there may be an intermunicipal agreement or at least an endorsement from another municipal board that you'll need to seek. And so we just want to recognize that that 8-week period from the time you might say, yes, I want to apply for this grant to the time it's due can be very full of a lot of steps that require coordination and collaboration. The state does have a nice application process online. Typically, the way we and other consultants, or if you are lucky enough to have a grant writer, work is that we'll create a portal on the Grants Gateway portal. Excuse me, we'll create a login on the Grants Gateway portal, and we'll share the login information between ourselves and you guys so that we can both upload information, and we work collaboratively to complete those grant applications in a timely fashion. It's a little bit clunky to review draft submissions of grant applications. You have to print this sort of clunky PDF of the questions, but we would typically circulate that out to our project team and make sure everyone's happy with the grant language before we hit apply. So it's a process, and so we want to plan early for it. And the timing right now is actually perfect. So start thinking about our projects. So I wanted to talk a little bit about feasibility studies. And I'm not sure what familiarity you might have with feasibility studies, but typically it's a high level analysis, either planning or engineering analysis to determine the viability of a project or an idea. And the goal is really to define very specifically what the project is or the problem that needs a solution, and to evaluate alternatives, but also to identify where there may be hurdles or challenges that need to be overcome, and to determine whether or not those challenges are something that can be managed or mitigated, to determine if you've got a viable opportunity to move forward with that project. The other thing a feasibility study would normally do is to develop some costs and schedules for your project. Might also identify permitting requirements, and that might be done in terms of your project schedule. So understanding kind of comprehensively from idea to implementation what it's going to take for you to get your project off the ground. Having some of the details about schedule and costs can help you with the buy-in that you are going to need in your municipality to move forward with a larger capital project. Feasibility studies are usually a fairly low cost way to get some of the technical details that you need to make some grant applications. Some grants do require a feasibility study. So the ones I can think of offhand, projects that are funded through the Environmental Facilities Corporation, those are typically for infrastructure related projects. The Green Innovation Grant Program, water and wastewater projects, large storm drainage projects, all require a feasibility study because the state wants to know a couple of things. One, they want to understand that the community's got some skin in the game, that they have made an initial investment to assess a particular project. Two, they want to be able to rely on a professional cost estimate, a professionally prepared cost estimate, so that they understand that the project costs have been developed in a manner that's consistent with industry requirements. Three, going through that feasibility study process does typically, by default, almost engage the public because you are doing this at the municipal board level. And so you're getting some early sense of community commitment towards a project. And all those things, if you know, they can be really favorable towards your grant funding application.
Brandy?
Yes.
So if a feasibility, I might have missed this, if a feasibility study isn't done by lay people, who does who do you contact to do feasibility studies?
Yeah, so typically communities are hiring consultants to do their feasibility studies. A lot of times the grant program requirements will say that you need a cost estimate that's been signed and sealed by a licensed professional engineer. So typically it's either the municipal engineer you're already working with in your community, if you've got a designated engineer, or if it's something that is outside of their scope of expertise, you may hire a consultant to do that work. Yeah.
Thank
Bill,
you.
did you have a question as well?
Yeah, Brandy, just on a feasibility study, are there grants for a feasibility study that are offered?
Sometimes there are. So an example would be EFC does have a feasibility study grant for water and wastewater infrastructure. And it's very specific. They want the study done in a very prescriptive manner. They're pretty good about handing out the $20,000 or $30,000 that it takes to put together those feasibility studies. In other instances, grants are not available. They want the community to be committed to that small dollar investment. So it just depends on what you're pursuing. Are there any other questions about that I can answer now? I was going to flip through a couple of examples just to give you an idea of kind of what you learn out of a feasibility study. I'll go real quick because I want to give time for questions at the end. So we work with the town of Red Hook, New York, in Dutchess County, and I've been their designated engineer for a number of years. They're a fabulous community to work with. They're very focused on implementing all sorts of plans. They're very aggressive about green infrastructure. And they have a really fabulous group of volunteers that have more energy than any group of people I've ever met before. And so I have been working with them on a number of different projects. But in terms of feasibility study, I'll give you one example. The town got a grant from DEC to install fast chargers. And I had a discussion with the liaison who was spearheading that project for the town. And he said, oh, we need a little sketch to show, you know, where the fast chargers are going to go and if they can fit in this area in our municipal parking lot. So what I'm showing on the screen right now is the equipment for the fast chargers. And lo and behold, you know, we did this little feasibility study that said, hey, this will all fit. This will be great. We'll go ahead and move forward. And our next step was to meet with the utility. And when we met with the utility said, oh, this is all well and good, but we cannot, we have to give you a new electric service for those fast chargers because they draw so much electricity. And to do that, we have to set a pad mounted transformer. So that's one of these big green boxes that sits on a big concrete slab. And so we thought we'd have a very kind of low impact, low profile charging station kind of near the front of the town hall parking lot where it could act almost as an advertisement for, you know, hey, I'm here, come and charge at me. But when when we met with Central Hudson, they said, no, 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 we need to put a new utility pole. I don't know if you guys can see my cursor, but we need to put a new utility pole right in the middle of the lawn in front of Town Hall. And then we need to set a 12 by 12 concrete pad with a 6-foot tall green transformer and 4 yellow bollards right in the front lawn of the town hall. And the town said, oh my goodness, like that's not going to work. So through the feasibility study, we were able to run through a couple of different alternatives, and I'll show you what we ended up with. But what we wanted was to achieve the objective of installing these fast chargers, but balance it against the aesthetics of what it would look like in front of town hall. So after running through, we probably ran through 4 or 5 different options where we met with the utility company and also with the charging installer to run through the various parameters that were required for siting all the various pieces of equipment. And what we ended up with was installing these fast chargers near the rear of the town hall, but that allowed us to site a lot of the more industrial looking equipment behind a fence, so as to limit the impact of that. In addition, it fits into a larger master plan for providing some improvements at town hall. So all in all, I think we got an outcome that everybody was satisfied with. But if we would have just let the installer put the equipment in where he wanted to, we would have ended up with something that aesthetically would have been really unappealing to the town. And so the feasibility assessment helped us work through the different alternatives in a way that delivered a solution that balanced the issues of wanting to have the fast chargers featured, but not wanting them to contribute to a deterioration of the aesthetic in front of the town hall.
Brandy, is it true that the DEC has stopped funding those now?
I actually am not sure if they've stopped funding those. I believe they had a limit and they were going to fund up to a certain dollar amount, and they may have reached that limit. But Wendy, I can tell you, there may also be, if you're hearing that they've stopped funding those, it may be because there's a supply chain issue.
Mm.
There's only one entity or 2 entities that make the steel cabinets that are the control panels for the fast chargers, and they are somewhere between 12 and 18 months backlogged right now. And it's a significant issue. Some of it, I guess, is driven by this huge investment, and the supply chain just isn't ramped up enough to meet the demand. But I've also been hearing that there's some demand for these same types of electrical equipment that the Ukraine war is contributing to, because they're going through so much electrical equipment right now. So yeah, a lot of different factors at play.
Thank you.
Another example, just so you get a sense of like what the content of a feasibility study might be. This is a summary, or excuse me, a table of contents for a green innovation grant program. They have a specific prescriptive requirement, and they want to know, an executive summary of what you're proposing. They want to understand what the community objectives are. There's a description of existing conditions, and in terms of green infrastructure, they're specifically looking at things like your existing drainage infrastructure, your soil conditions, your built environment, where are buildings, where are roads, and are you having any existing drainage problems? And then a description of the project. So, what will you be doing to improve your streetscape with green infrastructure practices? Some of the technical requirements, do you have enough space to manage the amount of water? That's the water quality volume management estimate. So they want some calculations undertaken. And then they want to understand what your schedule would be for moving forward with actual implementation, whether or not you're going to need any permits and approvals. Do you have a stream crossing? Are you going to impact wetlands? Do you have historic resource concerns that you need to factor into your timeline? What's your project cost estimate? What's the capital cost? What portion of that will the municipality bear? How much are you going to ask for with your grant? Are there in-kind services being factored in? And then I think importantly for all of us in terms of any project we're going to implement is, what's the long-term operation and maintenance? So how are you going to keep something going once you get it started? And then all the supporting information goes into the appendices. So we would typically do drawings and figures that show the context of where the project is going to be located, kind of a regional map of the area, and then maybe more site-specific survey information about a particular project area. The example I'm going to show you here is for an adaptive reuse of a mill building in Hudson, New York, where the city of Hudson has a combined sewer. And so we're proposing some green infrastructure practices to manage stormwater at that site, to reduce the load on the sewer system. And so we were providing some high-level plans pertaining to where those infrastructure practices would go, photos of the existing conditions, soil data, geotechnical information from SHPO. We want to coordinate with the state agencies, calculations, and then operation and maintenance plan. So this is a kind of a high level plan for a green infrastructure practice feasibility study, showing what types of practices would go where. So each color is a specific type of green infrastructure practice that would be implemented as proposed in the grant application. So not a really detailed drawing. It's certainly not something you're going to be able to construct from. It's just enough design to identify that the proposed practices will work in that particular area. And this drawing we're working in coordination with Wagner Hodgson Landscape Architecture out of Hudson. So thanks to them for making the drawing available. So those are just a couple of examples. You know, the technical assistance process can help you improve your grant outcomes. And I think, each of you can work in a manner with us that is targeted to what your particular needs are. But our goal is really to, help you focus, clarify your objectives, identify those existing resources, provide additional supporting data where we can, just drawing from resources we're plugged into as well as our experience, helping you identify costs and sources of funding, and supporting any efforts that you may need to undertake in terms of community engagement and outreach, public processes, working groups, things like that. And all of that together can help you focus your grant narrative and help you understand whether or not you need any other specific technical support so you can move forward with implementation, which is really what we want to see.